The street lights hummed like tired moths when she set down a brown paper bag on the stoop of a building in the financial district and knocked 3 times as if she were waking someone from a deep sleep. Rain had turned the sidewalks into mirrors that swallowed shoe soles and reflected the fluorescent glow of office towers. Her fingers were still warm from the takeout box she had carried under her coat, the smell of cumin and fried onions sharp against the cold. She was small, deliberate, and resolute. Her name was Maria Alvarez, 32, a single mother who balanced night classes and 2 part-time jobs, and that night she carried 5 steps she believed could change a life. Her gesture looked ordinary, almost invisible, but someone inside that building, a man named Daniel Reeves, had his life teetering on the edge of a decision that would change everything. What began as an offer for a cup of food became the first of 5 transformative steps that neither of them could have predicted. Stay with this story and you will see how kindness, strategy, and stubborn compassion rebuilt more than one future. The alley smelled of wet concrete, hot grease, and the faint sweetness of discarded pastries. The air held the low thrum of a subway far below and the bright beep of a delivery scanner. Maria's coat clung to her shoulders, still damp from a rain that had started as mist and turned into a steady insistence. In the lobby, a security guard named Marco glanced up from his screen, his breath visible in the cool air. He noticed the paper bag and the way Maria hesitated before she left a handwritten note folded on top. The note read simply, "Please." Marco picked up the bag and the note, and the flat fluorescent light made the ink look like a promise. Upstairs, behind a wall of glass, Daniel Reeves, CEO of a tech company that made billions and promised seamless futures, was hunched over a desk strewn with reports and an empty thermos. He had not planned to accept anything from a stranger that night, and the bag was the kind of interruption he had trained himself to ignore. Yet something in the paused sentence on the note, a single word that implied urgency and humility at once, made him stand and walk toward the lobby. He would later say that hunger was only part of his motivation. At the edge of his memory, there were other hungers, deaths, and a whisper of loneliness that had been growing louder in the months since his father died. The exchange was small and oddly ritualistic. Maria forked the rice with careful motions, as if every bite was a negotiation with time. Daniel sat on the bench in the little public atrium, the rain tapping a steady rhythm on the glass. They did not trade titles at first. They traded names, which came out like a relief. Maria's voice was steady, but a narrow river that avoided cliffs. Daniel's was evened and practiced, the voice of someone used to managing meetings and moods. They spoke of weather, of trains, of the ridiculous thing the elevator had done that day. Then, like 2 people stepping over a threshold they did not yet see, they offered each other stories. Maria spoke of her son, Leo, 5 years old, and chewing on every new experience like it might be the last. Daniel spoke of board meetings that blurred into other board meetings, of contracts that had no faces attached. When Daniel asked why Maria had left the bag on his stoop, she shrugged and said her son had a fever, and she thought a warm meal might be safer in a place that promised warmth. Daniel listened, and in that listening, something subtle began to shift. He took the first of Maria's 5 steps by accepting the meal, and by asking a question that would become the second step. Could you tell me more about Leo? That night, Maria sat on a bench in a small community center and told her story in 3 short pieces that stitched together the fabric of why she moved the way she did through the world. She had grown up in a house with the aroma of strong coffee and the low hum of a sewing machine. Her parents were immigrants from a coastal town where everyone knew the longitude of each other's sorrow. As a child, she learned to mend torn collars and share bread before she learned to say please. Her father taught her that work was a language and that dignity could be worn like a second skin. At 18, she left for the city to study nursing, and because she believed that healing was a form of justice. The city taught her other lessons.
At 23, she gave birth to Leo, and shortly after, the child's father left. The nights became a ledger of small, honest transactions: diaper changes, textbooks, part-time shifts. She took odd jobs, learned to budget by candlelight when the electricity faltered, and taught herself to sleep in fragmented hours without complaint. Then came a turning point that tightened her chest when she remembered it. Her mother fell ill, and they could not afford the prolonged care. Maria mortgaged a future degree for immediate medicine and watched as the debt altered her options. She promised herself 3 things at the hospital bed. She would finish her education, she would protect Leo from the instability she had seen, and she would never, if she could help it, let another family be made small by circumstance. That promise propelled her nights of work and study. She became a familiar face at the shelter kitchen where she volunteered, at the PTA where she argued for small, practical supports that made school accessible to parents who worked nights, and at local fundraisers where she quietly brokered breakfasts and babysitting swaps. She learned to make kindness practical and repeatable. These 3 paragraphs of past life explained why she arrived at Daniel's door that rainy evening with a bag of food and a list of 5 steps she believed in. After the meal, Daniel found he could not return to the sterile cascade of email threads. There was a note in the bag, a scribble of crayon Leo had made for someone he called a friend. It was a small sun with a crooked smile and the words, "You are loved." And when Daniel held that paper between his fingers, he felt the unsteady tremor of shame and relief. He had been moving through decisions that could displace hundreds of workers, a restructuring that had logic on paper and ruin in its margins. The sun reminded him of a desk he used to sit at in childhood, where there had been a father who pinned heroes in the form of paper rockets to a board. Suddenly, it felt wrong to approve a plan that would strip dignity from unnamed families. He asked Maria about safety nets and about what small changes at scale could look like. Maria, practical and immediate, outlined 5 steps she thought could anchor someone like Daniel who had power but no hunger for the day-to-day of people. The steps were simple and specific. Step 1 was presence. Step 2 was listening to a different kind of report. Step 3 was making a concrete offer that could be accepted without shame. Step 4 was connecting people by resources rather than pity. Step 5 was an accountability ritual, a public promise that had teeth. Daniel listened, and the meeting that began as one small act of charity became a blueprint for how a CEO might change his own company's course and, inadvertently, be saved. The moment of decision was not cinematic in the usual sense. It was a small office at 10 that night, a kettle that had been boiled 1 too many times, the light over the desk harsh and white. Daniel asked a question that made Maria flinch slightly because it carried a kind of authority she was not used to answering. He asked what she would do if she had the power to rewrite a company's policy regarding working parents. She looked at him, and the rain outside had thinned to a hush. Her voice was low and precise. She named staggered shifts, emergency childcare credits, education subsidies, paid sick days, and a transparent rehire policy for people returning from leave. Daniel wrote these words down. Then he surprised them both by saying he would pilot a program modeled on those 5 concrete asks in one of his divisions. Maria hesitated. Why would a CEO take such an instruction from a stranger, she asked. Daniel admitted honesty as a strategy and his own exhaustion from decisions that had reduced people to numbers. He said he wanted the pilot to be led by someone who lived the problem, not just wrote about it. Maria, who had always been the bridge between theory and home, felt the ground tilt. This was the second moment of tension, a place where fear met possibility and the cost of saying yes could be both personal and public. Moment of tension 1. She remembered the night she almost gave up. There had been a winter when Leo's fever would not break, and the landlord threatened eviction because a late payment had piled onto months of underemployment. Maria had sat at the kitchen table with a stack of medical bills and the sewing machine humming like a slow heart. Her hands had known how to mend clothes, but not how to mend the world. She had cried quietly until her tears were mere drops in the sink. At the shelter, a volunteer named Elena had put a cup of tea in front of her and reminded her of the 3 promises. That memory returned now as a lantern. The weight of Daniel's offer felt like that winter's ledger. Saying yes meant stepping into the glare of corporate eyes. Saying no meant staying small. She chose yes and felt fear and relief in equal measure. The pilot program required logistics and faces to operate it. Maria became the liaison, a role that fit her stubborn love of practical details. She named volunteers who would help and asked the company to fund subsidies for childcare and night class stipends for parents working irregular hours. The secondary characters appeared like a small ensemble. Marco, the security guard, agreed to ferry flyers to the building's mailroom. Jamal, the manager of the neighborhood shelter, offered space for early evening workshops. Priya, the HR director at Daniel's company, was skeptical but curious and became the internal point person who tracked budgets and compliance. Rosa, Maria's neighbor and a school aide, volunteered to run the first enrollment drive. Elena, the volunteer from the shelter, coordinated meals and informal mentorship. Finally, a delivery driver named Tomas, who knew the back alleys, helped with the logistical coordination that made the first sessions possible. Each person did a particular thing. Marco posted notices. Jamal opened doors. Priya pulled payroll rules into manageable language. Rosa brought parents in. Elena fed children between classes, and Tomas picked up supplies. 5 people, 5 tasks, and slowly the pilot began. In early meetings, the dialogue was raw and overflowing with working details. Daniel sat at a table with Maria and Priya and asked questions that revealed both a CEO's curiosity and a child's embarrassment at being out of his element. "How does this affect retention?" he asked, then immediately softened. "And how does it affect dignity?" Maria answered with examples that smelled of diapers and textbooks and the sound of a baby settling. Priya pushed back on budget constraints and compliance rules. Her sentences were clipped, pragmatic, full of the language of spreadsheets. Jamal spoke softly about trust and how families often avoided formal help out of shame. Rosa handed a sheet of names with phone numbers scrawled in different inks. Tomas complained about timetables that did not match the city's bus routes. Elena reminded everyone about the simple law that kindness becomes policy when it is repeatable and measurable. The exchanges rippled, shaped near misses into real plans, and each little pushback became a point to refine rather than a wall to stop them. The dialogue in these meetings was long, sometimes awkward, sometimes full of laughter that broke tension like a window opening. The third moment of tension arrived when a member of the board leaked news of the pilot to a columnist who framed it as a PR stunt, an attempt by Daniel to polish a bruised public image after a product failure. The headline asked if a CEO handing out hot meals was a savior at heart or face. The article ignited a firestorm on social media. The community of workers who were beginning to trust the program recoiled. Parents who had enrolled their children pulled back, afraid of association. Maria watched as the scaffolding they had built suddenly trembled. She felt responsible for a program that carried people's livelihoods. She had to decide whether to keep the program open and face scrutiny, or to pause it and risk letting families down. Daniel, who had been criticized in the column, called Maria, and his voice broke in a way she had not heard before. He apologized for the exposure and said he would go to the press himself to insist on transparency. They talked long into the night about the ethics of visibility and the fragile courage of people who made themselves known in order to be helped. They decided to double down and to open the books publicly, inviting an independent audit and testimony from the parents themselves. It was a risky move and required a public relations strategy, legal clearance, and a set of community mediators that Maria and Jamal organized in 48 hours. Procedural note about how the company handled cameras and logs of the pilot and how privacy protocols were applied in the aftermath. The HR team, led by Priya, created a protocol of consent forms, anonymized data aggregation, and a clear opt-in for testimonials. They consulted with Jamal and Maria to ensure language was accessible and not coercive. The IT team redacted identifying information from all internal reports. A simple spreadsheet captured participation rates, retention numbers, and improvements in punctuality. The transparency strategy meant releasing an executive summary of the pilot with anonymized results and a list of third-party auditors. That process took 3 weeks of meetings, a small legal retainer, and a community advisory board whose members included Rosa and Elena. The technical work translated into trust. Across 4 months of the pilot, small triumphs stacked like kindling. Attendance at night classes rose by 30% among parents in the program. Employee retention in the pilot division improved measurably, and HR reported a decrease in unplanned absences. Leo's fever subsided permanently after
a round of antibiotics arranged by a clinic connected through the shelter. A father who had been at risk of losing his apartment received a subsidy that bridged a single month and prevented eviction. The program became less about headlines and more about routines that kept families stable. Daniel began to visit the community center more often, not as a passerby, but as an active participant, sitting in on workshops and listening to parents with a notebook and a pen, often forgetting that the people he spoke with had names on an org chart. He started to write his own emails differently, including stories from the pilot that humanized otherwise dry metrics. Maria's 5 steps had become a template for change that scaled because it was anchored in dignity, not charity. The 4th moment of tension emerged when someone in Daniel's inner circle accused him of conflating sympathy with strategy. A senior executive named Claire questioned whether corporate resources should address what she called private choices. The comment echoed in a boardroom where budgets were sacred. The accusation hit Maria like a sudden cold. She was small, without a corner office, and yet she had become a face of the program. Being the face carried risks that extended beyond reputation. Parents who had trusted her now looked for answers she did not always have. She convened a meeting with Priya, Jamal, Marco, and Daniel. The dialogue was serrated and honest. Claire argued for stricter KPIs. Jamal insisted that trust could not be reduced to numbers. Priya suggested a hybrid approach that satisfied government's needs while preserving human stories. Daniel, who had once been uncomfortable speaking plainly about his own stakes, said that the choice was not between charity and efficiency, but between a company that noticed and one that looked the other way. He pledged to fund the program for a year from his own foundation and to write a magnanimous but clear memo to the board explaining the moral calculus behind long-term investment in workers. The memo framed the pilot as a long-term asset rather than a short-term expense, and tied the program to retention metrics and corporate reputation measures. In doing so, he risked his standing but gained clarity. Maria felt the relief of someone who had climbed a hill and found a road leading forward. Integration into daily life was gradual and full of sensory texture. The community center smelled like coffee and crayons in the mornings, and at night it held the hum of small study groups and the rustle of diapers being changed. Maria taught a Saturday workshop on budgeting that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and marker ink. Daniel showed up once with a thermos and sat in the back, listening. Marco provided extra hours for parents to pick up packages after their shifts. Priya scheduled mandatory training for managers that included empathy simulations and a share of time dedicated to listening to employee stories. Rosa organized playdates that doubled as networking events. Elena started a small library of donated books for children that had a rainbow of taped labels and a patchwork of covers. Tomas coordinated a delivery rota that made sure emergency groceries reached families by evening. Each named person became a node in a network that began to look like a neighborhood rather than a transaction system. Small victories rippled outward. A young mother who had once arrived at 2 a.m. with a newborn found her attendance at classes regular enough to enroll in a certificate program. A man named Hector, who had been on the verge of leaving his job, accepted a transfer that allowed him to be closer to his elderly mother.
The shelter's intake numbers stabilized as families chose to stay rather than move between temporary solutions. The fifth and final step in Maria's plan was the accountability ritual. The company hosted a community day where parents, managers, volunteers, and local agencies came together. Daniel stood on a makeshift stage, rain-softened flags hanging behind him, a visual motley of community banners and corporate logos. He read a short statement that acknowledged mistakes, named the pilot's metrics, and promised a timeline for expansion. He handed the mic to Maria, who spoke in a voice that carried the economy of someone who had learned to be precise with her words. She warned against the idea that a single program could fix structural inequality, but argued that small systems of care could shore up lives in meaningful ways. She asked for commitments, more mentors, flexible scheduling, and a dedicated childcare fund. The ritual concluded with a symbolic act of return. Daniel handed Maria a small envelope on stage, containing a formal partnership pledge and a list of names of employees who volunteered to mentor. The gesture was not theatrical, it was concrete. The envelope became a public covenant and a seed of a legacy that carried the words second chance and hope. It was the physical culmination of 5 steps, a present that meant something real. People cheered softly, the way a community applauds the practical rather than the dramatic. 3 months into the program, the company published the independent audit. It showed improved retention rates in the pilot division, reductions in emergency leave, and a measurable improvement in employee satisfaction scores. It also documented shortcomings, areas where the program had failed to reach the most vulnerable. The audit recommended scaling up with modifications, increasing funding for emergency rent relief, and adding a confidential hotline for parents seeking immediate help. The numbers mattered because they allowed the board to see the program as both humane and pragmatic. Daniel used the audit to make a case for investment, and the board approved a phased scaling plan. During this period, Maria continued to work nights and attend classes, but she was no longer just surviving. She taught a seminar that guided managers through lived experiences of working parents. Priya was promoted to lead a new unit focused on employee welfare.
Jamal secured a grant that tripled the shelter's capacity. Marco took on a role coordinating corporate community logistics. Rosa became an assistant director at her school. Elena launched a literacy initiative. And Tomas organized a citywide distribution network used by other nonprofits. Leo started kindergarten and learned to say his mother's name with the confidence of a child who felt seen. 1 month after the community day, small but visible changes had taken root. The company implemented a pilot commute subsidy and an emergency childcare voucher. A newsroom piece that had once criticized the program ran a follow-up that focused on a single mother who had completed a certificate program and obtained stable employment. Local families exchanged recipes and phone numbers in the community center, and the donated library grew by boxes of books. Parents who had been hesitant began to bring their concerns forward in monthly open forums. The program's first story of measurable success was a young woman named Anna who parlayed night classes into a promotion and became a mentor for others. The first month was a test of momentum. 3 months after inception, the pilot expanded into 2 more divisions. An external nonprofit, impressed by the transparency and traction, partnered with Daniel's company to provide scaled training for managers. Enrollment in adult education programs increased, and early indicators showed a drop in turnover by 12% in participating units. The local shelter announced a formal collaboration, and Jamal reported he had halved the wait list for emergency childcare on nights when corporate volunteers staffed extra shifts. Maria, who had been balancing so many roles, presented the program's work at a community conference and received a modest stipend that allowed her to reduce night shifts temporarily. Leo began to make art at school and brought home drawings that were taped to the refrigerator. There were small holidays celebrated with potlucks, the smell of empanadas and coffee filling rooms that had once held only meetings and memos. 6 months later, the landscape looked materially different. The company adopted a permanent policy that incorporated the 5 steps as options for employees across the organization. The policy included childcare subsidies, guaranteed flexible scheduling, a rehire clause for parents returning from leave, and a small emergency fund overseen by a joint committee of employees and community partners. Outside the company, other local firms had reached out to learn.
The city council used the pilot as a model for a new grant program aimed at supporting working parents, and a coalition formed to advocate for systemic supports. Leo's kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Walker, sent a note praising his curiosity and the way he shared snacks with classmates. Maria had fewer late-night shifts and more time to study, and she had accepted a job coordinating outreach for the very program she had helped design. Daniel, who had once measured success in quarterly margins, now wrote op-eds about corporate responsibility and testified at a council hearing about public-private partnerships. The community day had become a catalyst
for structural change and a legacy that carried Maria's insistence on dignity and practicality. In the quiet months after the initial storm, there were small personal returns that felt like moral accounting made visible. Daniel visited Maria and Leo at a school fair and brought a simple boxed cake that Leo insisted on opening with flour-dusted fingers. They spoke in simpler terms than before. Daniel thanked Maria for reminding him that policies touch bodies and hearts. He admitted that he had been saved from a form of moral complacency by the demands of small lives. Maria said that she had learned to trust that systemic change could begin at a stoop with a paper bag and a note that said, "Please." Marco stopped by the community center to sign up for a parenting class and found himself embarrassed and delighted by how much he enjoyed reading children's books aloud. Priya and Jamal continued to hold monthly meetings that ensured the program evolved in response to real needs. The accountability ritual continued as an annual community day, a public reminder that promises could be kept if names were spoken and resources aligned. If this story leaves you with a single thought, let it be this: a single concrete gesture rooted in compassion and tactical wisdom can ripple outward into policy, into people's lives, into a small legacy that becomes hard to unmake. Maria's 5 steps were not magical. They were practical, messy, and political. They required names, schedules, volunteers, and the stubbornness to hold people accountable. They asked for kindness in the form of commitment, not pity. They turned a cup of food into a partnership that changed a company, a neighborhood, and 2 lives in particular. 1 month, 3 months, 6 months later, the outcomes were measurable. Jobs retained, children stabilized, policies changed, and a community that learned to see one another. If this touched you, take a breath and think of one small step you could offer someone in your circle. Share your story in the comments with the prompt, "There was a time when a small gesture changed everything." Your story matters and helps others see that kindness scaled is policy in the making. If you want more stories like this, consider subscribing and sharing. Sometimes a life is saved not by a single grand act, but by a series of small, determined steps taken by someone who refuses to accept that systems must remain indifferent.